coming together today, I'm reminded of something this committee has done before, and it goes back to Old Testament scripture. It says, "Come now, let us reason together." And what the scripture's telling us is that we've been confronted with the problem, and the question is for us is how do we deal with it? We've been confronted with the issue. The question is how do we deal with it? And what's concerning, and as I see this today, and from Mr. Floyd and Ms. Jacobs, the loss and the realness in your body language, in your eyes, and in your voice, is the pain of a nation right now coming to grips with conflicting issues and values in their head, wanting a safe and civil society in which all of us get along, and in a way that should, in a society that we know doesn't. When you see your loved one murdered, when you find out your loved one murdered, in a time in which we're just all struggling. But it is not surprising to this committee. But it's unfortunate for this committee because in the previous Congress, we actually had a police working group in which we went to Houston. Chief Acevedo was there. We worked and we had a good couple of days of meetings. We went to Detroit. We went to Atlanta. We also had meetings here. And we were beginning these conversations, but we didn't continue. When this new Congress set in, we didn't do anything. And now we're here again, faced with a crisis of the moment. And Congress, unfortunately, lives by this seeming decree. Put it off until we have to have a hearing like this, and we mourn the loss of the things most precious to us. My question is really, what can we do? And Ms. Jacobs, you said something earlier. It's talking about communities and jobs. It's about putting our communities together, the policing issue, and someone who is a son of a law enforcement officer. My father was a state trooper. I sympathize with this. I watched it. And one of the most grievous days in my father's ever memory is I remember when one of his own did something horribly wrong and they took him to prison. And it said, and the reason is he come home and I remember him being down and he looked at me and he said, the problem is, he said, everybody thinks I did it. He said, we got to get rid of that. But what have we done? There are things that we can do to help our communities. This committee came together on the First Step Act, on criminal justice reform, sentencing reform, working with the Senate to actually make a difference in our communities, to actually take the president who signed that, who made it a pillar of what he wants to do and sign it. That's what a committee together can do. We've not done that here. We've actually I worked with the late Elijah Cummings, chairman, on the Fair Chance Act. We talk about jobs. Then the Fair Chance Act was giving those with the criminal records a fair shot at applying for jobs because we unchecked the box where they wouldn't have to go through a screening beforehand. Let's see if they can actually set on their own and try a new chance in life. It's about making our communities whole again. And yet there are things in this bill that we can all agree on, but there's things in this bill that I wish we would take a little more time with. That we would just sit back and say, what is this going to happen? We've had task force set up with the Justice Action Network, COVID-19 Emergency Justice Task Force that looked at how we deal with our prison populations. A solicitor from my hometown, Stephanie Woodard, was a part of that. Others have been a part. This is a time for conversations to find good answers without unintended consequences. Ms. Bongino, I have a question for you, and it's been sort of intimated. Are there things about this that concern you? Not that they're not ideas that need to be discussed, but when you look at some of the issues around qualified immunity, some of the micromanagement in this bill, what concerns you when you see this from a law enforcement perspective?
Well, as the great Thomas Sowell says often, it's not what you do, it's asking and then what. Listen, I get it. There are serious issues with qualified immunity. Nobody on the panel's wrong, or on the witnesses either, bringing them up. There's no question about that. We're in full agreement. The problem is, if you were to repeal qualified immunity, have you considered and then what? Have you considered the fact that police officers' legal bills, some who may in fact deserve it for doing an awful job, but some who may not, will be so oppressive that you won't have police officers? Have you considered the fact that some of these police officers, out of fear of the rather litigious society we live in now, unfortunately, will now be afraid in the street to go and do their jobs and be proactive in communities that need it most? I mean, does anybody ask that question? Or are we just gaffing that off to create an interesting soundbite? The then what matters here, folks. Qualified immunity has issues. You can work around the edges, but the margins matter here.
And I think what we're bringing up here is not an issue that we don't need to discuss. And when we were discussing this through our police working group, we went to these communities, and I appreciate what you said, that it has to go both ways. The community and the police have to have these conversations both ways. I'm concerned here, and I appreciate that concern, because this is heading to where I know it always heads here. This is the hearing. Next week we mark up a bill. Next week it goes to the floor. Then we hope the Senate does something. And then we sort of go back and forth and hope that it gets right. My hope is that, Mr. Chairman, we get this right. We did it before. Let's make it happen again and take the comments of these committees on both sides. Mr. Crump and everybody, and Mr. Scott, we can work on this. I've done it before. This committee has a history of working together. Let's do this, and let's get with the President and the Senate and make a difference so that lives are valued.